Journalists Roundtable is a half-hour discussion with Pennsylvania journalists about the week's top political news and current events. Journalists Roundtable is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to this week's edition of Journalists Roundtable. I'm Francine Schertzer. Our guests this week are Tom Lehman, principal reporter for WGAL TV in Lancaster, Zack, reporter for PennLive, and John Finnerty, managing editor for CapitolWire and State Affairs. John, we'll start with you. All three of you have been covering aspects of budget hearings. How much of what happens within these hearings is actually reflected in final budget negotiations in June?
Well, I mean, I think you're certainly going to get hints as sort of like where the battle lines are going to be drawn. Maybe, I think it's so early, and we're at that point of the time. Right now, when you talk to people and you say, are we in for another nightmare like we had last year? And everyone's like, no. But I think if you asked people the same question a year ago, they'd have said the same thing. So it's a little hard to know how bad things are going to be at this point. But we are having pretty much the same arguments we had last year. The governor's not really asking for a whole heck of a lot different than he's asked for every other year, and the Republicans are raising the same objections. I guess as far as, whether or not we're going to have an on-time budget really kind of just depends on just sort of whether or not there's a will to get it done. And we do have all these big elections this year, so there's probably there's traditionally you would think they'd be motivated to get a deal done, but whether or not that comes to pass, we'll see.
Tom, your thoughts?
I think I'd have to agree. I mean, I think we're in a lot of the same lines that we were last year. The governor is proposing a lot of spending. I think we're talking about it before the show. I think it's about $53.3 billion if you round up. But the bottom line is they're going to have to get creative a little bit. There's going to be money that's probably going to need to come from reserves and also be generated by other things, potentially skill games or cannabis. And there's even complications with that and whether those revenue estimates are what they would end up being. I think the big issue that's going to be coming down to the level of what the final budget looks like is there the political will? And some of these issues like cannabis, like skill games have kind of been lingering now for a few years in an election year when you really have to start making some decisions when you look at the balance sheet for the state, whether it's the governor's budget or not. I think those issues might play into some of the decision making because not only do you have issues where people maybe have some, stake in the elections about whether or not they support cannabis legalization or regulating skill games or some of the other issues that are going to be discussed this year. I think that may play into A, whether we get an on-time budget, but also B, whether some of these things end up being part of the final product.
Yeah, my experience has been, I think in the budget hearings, you see a lot of the issues that sort of run below the surface, and the public doesn't necessarily always see that. Yesterday, the day before, there was an extended discussion in the Senate about whether the state is overfunding the Public Transit Trust Fund, and that's something that I don't think that the public is generally that attuned to, but it's one of those things that gets debated kind of in the background for to some extent, and it's all these little things that kind of have to add up to getting a budget deal through. I will say to what Tom's saying, I think there is an increasing amount of, I'd almost call it fatigue over kind of treading over the same ground. Scott Martin, the Senate Appropriations Chairman, saying the other day that they're clearly not happy that the governor keeps bringing forth the same things, particularly on the revenue side with marijuana, skill games, things like that, keeps bringing forward the same things that they really don't seem to be that interested in or seem to think are a too big of a lift to get done realistically. And we're just kind of in the same lock that we've been probably for the past two cycles. And I think there's a lot of recognition that it's kind of getting, there's some fatigue setting in. Yeah.
To what extent do you think federal initiatives, particularly things like cuts to Medicaid, will impact the state's bottom line?
I think a lot of that is kind of a slow roll. Some of it doesn't hit until later budget cycles. The Medicaid changes and the changes to SNAP and a number of other things are mostly, for the best of my understanding, an upfront concern for the Department of Human Services, just on the administrative side. Running work requirements and things like that costs a lot of money for them to get those systems up and running.
I think, I spoke with DHS Secretary Valer-Kush the other day about this after their hearing, and we talked about some of those potential funding reductions coming down the line, because obviously there's certainly an increased price tag this year that, depending on who you talk to, there's various thoughts about how do you solve that solution. But down the line, I think there's a general concern. And so, what I've heard from some Senate Republicans is the decisions we start making now will help us down the line potentially deal with some of those funding reductions, or perhaps we just need to find ways to reduce what we are spending on healthcare, on social services, especially if it's just going to keep being shifted further and further into our laps as far as what we have to cover. But, asking Secretary Valer-Kush about this, one of the points she made is if we were to try to make up the entire difference of what we're going to lose from the federal government, she said it's not impossible, but it is very difficult, and it's going to be a lot of money to try and make up. I think certainly hundreds of millions of dollars, and that may be something down the line that the state will either have to make the decision: are we going to find a way to fund this, or are we going to simply say some of these services we just can't afford?
How has enrollment in programs like Penny been affected by the elimination of premium caps from the COVID era?
Penny has taken what they're describing as a significant hit. Disenrollments, or people dropping coverage, are down significantly. Their net numbers are down. And they're projecting that it's going to continue to get worse. A lot of people may have signed up for insurance this year and are now realizing they can't really afford it because the extra federal tax credits aren't there. So those rolls are going to continue to drop. I think it'll become clear a little later on maybe how bad that is, and that may also influence the state's decision to try to backfill some of those funds.
How does that affect the premium cost for everybody else that's involved in the program if the enrollment keeps dropping?
There's generally a sort of a net effect as more and more healthy younger people leave the program because they can't afford the insurance. The remaining people are costlier, and so that tends to drive up premiums for the remaining group. It's kind of there's kind of a spillover effect that you can't get away from, and there's a couple tweaks you can make, but those are mostly at the federal level, and the state's kind of now in a position of seeing those premiums potentially continuing to go up, with not a whole lot you can do about it unless the state starts to backfill major portions of the lost credits. But like Tom was saying, there's you start to add those up, you start to add Medicaid, you start to add SNAP up. We're getting into multi-billion-dollar price tag on some of those things.
On the topic of healthcare, John, you had written about the Department of State created a task force aimed at eliminating misinformation that comes from AI. Well, what brought their focus to this?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this has to do with just the idea that kids are using AI, using their phones all the time. Apparently not in school anymore, or not shortly. But that if you're talking to ChatGPT all day long, and you start asking ChatGPT what to do about I don't feel so hot today, or I'm having negative thoughts. There's real concern about how chat the chat responds to that. There's evidence that that it's really there cite cases where kids said I want to do this, that, or the other thing, and the chat comes back and says, well, you really shouldn't, but if you're going to, this is how you do it, and so they're trying to crack down. They created a reporting form to kind of say if you encounter you're using one of these AI devices or systems, and you're asking for advice, and it's giving you advice that seems like it's coming from a doctor, they're saying, the system needs to explain whether or not there actually is a doctor involved, or if it is just the AI answering. And on the other side, if it is responding and giving medical advice, that if a doctor's not involved, the state is going to start cracking down if it's providing advice that's inappropriate.
In December of last year, President Trump signed an executive order preempting states' AI regulations if they conflict with federal policies. So keeping that in mind, how would state policing or state regulation interact with that executive order?
I guess we'll have to see. Shapiro likes to brag about how he beats Trump every time he runs against him. So we'll see.
I think it's interesting because Attorney General Dave Sunday and the governor have not always been on the same page about challenging the Trump administration in court. But Sunday has said, if the state passes an AI law, we'll defend it. And he has signed on to a letter with other attorney generals saying we don't want the federal government to preempt us from doing things like being able to go after people who are making horrible deepfake images of children or other people that are obviously harmful. There's other things that depending on how you read that AI executive order from the president, may or may not be allowed. But I think generally speaking, it's kind of an interesting unity, if you will, between these two politicians who, again, haven't always been on the same side on that particular issue of challenging the Trump administration.
Well, I think that's one of the more interesting things about the whole AI and data center kind of emerging controversies we're having is you're seeing, some strange bedfellows and some strange alliances emerging, particularly over some of these arguments about local control, or as you say, sort of state control versus federal control. You're seeing that where, the governors kind of try to roll out these policies where they're kind of having like a statewide guidance, and all over the state, Republican and Democrats are getting besieged by calls from, their constituents saying, you need to help us stop these things. We had, they had a committee vote earlier this week that was 14-12 with all the Democrats in favor of it and all the Republicans against it. And then the environmental groups came out and said, they agreed with the Republicans. So it's kind of like in the last 6 months, I think this AI data center thing has just completely kind of overtaken a lot of the oxygen in the room, and some of the things that we're getting bored talking about the same issues over and over again. So it's like, well, we actually have controversies to talk about, and some of the budget stuff that's normally at the heart of the budget's not really what people are focused on right now.
Since Tom just brought up this issue, Zack, you had written about how Governor Shapiro has taken the lead on filing numerous lawsuits against Trump administration policies rather than the Attorney General. Why is the governor leading on these?
There was a budget hearing where some of the Democrats were pressing Dave Sunday a little bit on why he isn't doing what the Attorney General would traditionally do. And there is kind of a unique situation, as Sunday said during that hearing, which is that you have a Republican Attorney General, a Democratic governor, and a divided legislature. And in Pennsylvania's setup under the Commonwealth Attorneys Act, the governor can request the ability to basically act on his own volition to sue the federal government or any other agency through the Office of the General Counsel, which is directly under the governor and not the AG. I haven't heard Dave Sunday really say that he would never sue Trump or sue the federal government or anything say anything to the effect that that Shapiro isn't doing the right thing. He seems to just want to say that this is something that's maybe better handled by the governor, and I think is kind of, in that way, avoiding the potentially awkward situation of having a Republican AG, going after a Republican president. I've always gotten the sense that Sunday is more interested in the criminal justice side, going after, gun trafficking, human trafficking, things like that, and less interested in the civil suits, particularly interagency, state versus federal government, stuff like that. Through that hearing, I think you get the sense that he is very content leaving some of that stuff up to Shapiro for some pretty obvious political reasons.
I'd like to shift gears for just a moment, John. You'd covered the Human Services budget hearing and talked particularly about Secretary Val Arkush talking about logistical problems with the proposal to ban junk food from SNAP benefits. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those were?
Sure. I mean, that's kind of the funny stuff that I guess maybe people don't think through until it happens. She was noting that some of these states where they have implemented these sort of crackdowns on junk food and soda, they kind of struggle to define what is junk food, and then who's responsible for actually determining what belongs in your cart, and it basically comes down to the state will hand down these definitions, and then they're really parsing things in novel ways. We were talking before we came in that one of the questions was is a Rice Krispie treat candy or is it a cereal bar? There were things with like if you get a can of coffee, those they call it like a Starbucks drink. If it's just coffee, it's no good. But if it has cream in it, it is acceptable. And then so it's up to the grocery store to know that, to tell you when you come, and if you don't, then they can get in trouble. And every state has its own system. The one thing that Secretary Arkush brought up is obviously we're surrounded by other states, and so if you're in southwestern Pennsylvania and you're in a grocery store and someone from West Virginia comes with their little card, you need to know what West Virginia's rules are. Obviously, there's not been a whole lot of enthusiasm from the Shapiro administration to do any kind of junk food crackdown. So we're probably not imminently going to have to deal with that issue. I think it is more forestalling it. If people are talking about it, she said, we need to think through what this would look like. Obviously, last year we did see them kind of implement some more of the carrot approach with this food bucks program, where if you have food stamps, you get extra credit for buying healthy food. And I think that's probably the way that they want to go in the short term, just because it's a little easier, I think.
On the issue of SNAP benefits, Zack, your article that was published today, you talk a little bit about the federal changes that tied the state's error rate to additional costs involved with administering the program. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, like we were saying, that's one of a number of situations where the state could potentially see cuts from the feds. And that's one of those things that's also a little bit further on down the line. But the interesting thing with SNAP is that your error rate needs to be under 6% for the current federal fiscal year. And if it's not, then in the next federal fiscal year, the state will be on the hook for 15% of the benefits, which is $700 million. So there's kind of sort of a do or die year here where the state needs to get its error rate under a certain target in order to avoid basically, a huge cost cliff that could potentially end food benefits in Pennsylvania if that were to happen. So it's another example of some of the recent federal policy shifting costs onto the states in a way that's kind of going to grow over a certain period of time, and there's some sort of stuff happening behind the scenes that could actually have big impacts, not necessarily on the current budget, but on future budgets.
What kind of factors impact the error rate?
Error rate, to the best of my understanding, is mostly, it's not necessarily fraud. I think you'll see some people imply that it is, but in most cases, it's not. It's paperwork not being filed correctly, things not being signed, pay stub not being up to date, which results in somebody receiving a little bit too many or too high of benefit or slightly too low of benefit. Things like that the feds want the states to be efficient in their administration, but there was also nationwide a significant increase in error rates during COVID, coming out of COVID when people were cycling on and off benefits very rapidly. And now the feds are saying you need to get your error rate down drastically this year or you're going to see significant cuts in future years, which is putting a lot of states kind of in a crunch, including Pennsylvania. But according to Secretary Arkush this week, we're currently tracking basically right at the 6% level. So they are kind of riding the wire going into next fiscal year when we could see the cuts.
Another budget hearing that had garnered headlines over the last week or so is the state police's appearance. Tom, you had covered this. Talk a little bit about some of the concerns that senators were voicing over how the state police handled the arson attack at the governor's residence last April.
Yeah, so it was a pretty pretty wide-ranging hearing as far as questions on that particular issue. I think one of the big things that happened as far as questioning was, did the immediate and sort of extended response to the arson attack at the governor's residence last year, did it result in sort of the right calls about what was being made? You had concerns being raised from, are we legally spending more than $1 million at the governor's private residence should the governor have been taken somewhere else? And you saw some questions raised, including by Senator Tracy Pennycook, who suggested and insisted on multiple occasions during the hearing that the governor should have been taken to Fort Indian Town Gap in Lebanon County, which is military housing up there. They would not have been able to use the lieutenant governor's mansion because it's not fit for habitation right now. But it was suggested take him to military housing. And then you also had some other questions come up about, again, the legality of spending taxpayer money on a private residence. And these questions were sort of the continued scrutiny about what happened and whether or not PSP is responding correctly. But I think one of the commonalities in some of this questioning, is particularly on the taxpayer money side, is, what is the limit? What is something that we're comfortable with? Because this is an attack that was unprecedented. In talking with Scott Martin, the Senate Appropriations Chairman, he said, we can do both things here. We can understand that this was obviously a unique situation and that we probably can do a better job securing our lawmakers, our leaders, and the governor. But we also need to talk about, what are the rules going to be? What are we going to put on as far as guardrails to make sure that we're not haphazardly spending dollars that we don't need to? There's been a lot of scrutiny over what's been happening at the governor's residence in Montgomery County. But I will note, during all of this, the acting commissioner of PSP has said we had to act quickly. We needed to secure his private residence. We did not have anywhere else really to put him at the time. I interviewed him later in the week after some of these questions were raised, and he said we had to take him somewhere. And at that moment, we already had some level of security at his house. We're familiar with securing it. That was where we were going to go. We needed to spend money to make sure that we could keep him there for at least several months.
Is there legal clarity on whether the state police required additional procurement approvals for some of the spending, particularly with the governor's residence?
Having talked to the Treasury Department as early, or I should say as late as yesterday, they said they are still reviewing whether these bills can be paid or not. There's concern that the procurement code would bar spending these dollars on a private residence, and then that creates some new questions about what's, is there a corrective measure there? What needs to happen? But it's definitely up in the air. Lieutenant Colonel George Bivens said he would not speculate with me when I talked to him last week about it. But it is sort of a question that's looming over all of this. And again, goes back to that question, do they need to start making some changes in the law to allow for things like this to happen?
You'd also talked a little bit in one of your reports about litigation over the boundary line between the governor's personal residence and a neighbor due to some of these security enhancements that are being put in place. Why did this go to litigation, and do you think this is political? I
won't speculate as to the political motivations. I think that there's been some reporting about that. But where we got to a lot of this, and there's been a ton of reporting on this, but the gist of it is there's this section, essentially between these two properties that state police essentially wanted to build through. And there has been some work there, I believe, since then. But both these parties, the neighbor that boundary lines after they went and checked appears to have that land within their boundary area, is opposed to some of these changes. And they've been opposed to state police being in that area, essentially securing it, while the Shapiros are now essentially litigating in Montgomery County Court that they've been taking care of that property. Really, it should be ours, since everybody's always thought it was anyway. One lawsuit is in federal court, the other is in county court. But it does kind of go, again, back to this issue of how was this handled after the attack? were corners being cut, and ultimately what will be the result here as far as the way taxpayer dollars are being spent.
John, I want to come back to you for a moment. You had written about the House retaining 2 seats in special elections at the end of February. Mm-hmm. Do you foresee any scenario where the majority flips power either in the House or Senate in this year's general election?
Maybe. I don't know. The Senate has been in the Republicans' hands for as long as for a very long time, and every 4 or 8 years, Democrats will talk about this is the year. This might be the year. It's it's a very weird year. There are some, you can actually see the path for them, I guess. You would think that it would be easier for the Republicans to flip the House back because the margin's so close, but it's politics right now, and nationally particularly, things change so quickly. We don't know if there's even going to be an election in the fall, right? So if you believe what you read on the internet, we'll see. But yeah, I think that if you're going to see a chamber flip, if I was going to bet, I would probably bet on the Senate at this point. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Go ahead, Zack.
Well, I would say that Democrats are probably feeling better about their chances of flipping the Senate now than they have in a while. I think just because their polling showing that they're getting enough of a tailwind from the backlash to the president and to Republicans at the federal level that's going to carry them through down to the state level. And from a map standpoint, the Republicans do have some vulnerable incumbents up in the Senate this year. And to what Tom was talking about earlier, I think that's why you saw a lot of people really going after Senator Penny Cook for her comments about Fort Indiantown Gap, because she's up for re-election this year and she's in a vulnerable district, and Democrats have made it clear they're going to try to take her out, and they think that's one of their best opportunities for a pickup. So we've already entered a dynamic where you can't, if you say something controversial, somebody's going to come after you, because it's a very, very clearly a place for them to try to take back power.
Tom, you get the last word.
Well, I'll just say the other seat I'm watching is the James Malone seat, the ones that Democrats flipped in a special election very recently, and that's a red district. But the question is going to be, can Democrats hold it with a moderate Democrat and with some of these headwinds facing Republicans in the upcoming election potentially?
I'd like to thank our guests, Tom Lehman, political reporter for WGAL TV in Lancaster, Zack Hoops, reporter for PennLive, and John Finnerty, managing editor for CapitolWire and State Affairs. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.
Full episodes of politics and policy content like the program you just listened to are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Discover other shows like the Capitol Preview, On the Issues, candidate interviews, and more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.